Chapter 4, Part 2 of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Mapp by E.F. Benson. Chapter 4, Part 2. Diva had been watching Janet's retreating figure, and feeling that, though revenge was sweet, revenge was also strangely expensive, for she had sacrificed one of the most strikingly successful frocks she had ever made on that smoking altar. Now her revenge was gratified, and deeply she regretted the frock. Miss Mapp's heart was similarly wrung by torture. Revenge, too, had been hers, general revenge on Diva for existing, but this dreadful counterstroke had made it quite impossible for her to enjoy the use of this frock any more, for she could not habit herself like a housemaid. Each, in fact, had, as matters at present stood, completely wrecked the other, like two express trains meeting in top-speed collision, and since the quarrel had clearly risen to its utmost height, there was no further joy of battle to be anticipated, but only the melancholy task of counting the corpses. So they paused, breathing very quickly and trembling, while both sought for some way out. Besides, Miss Mapp had a bridge party this afternoon, and if they parted now in this extreme state of tension, Diva might conceivably not come, thereby robbing herself of her bridge and spoiling her hostess's table. Naturally, any permanent quarrel was not contemplated by either of them, for if quarrels were permanent in Tilling, nobody would be on speaking terms any more with anyone else in a day or two, and, hardly less disastrous, there could be no fresh quarrels with anybody, since you could not quarrel without words. There might be songs without words, as Mendelssohn had proved, but not rows without words. By what formula could this deadly antagonism be bridged without delay? Diva gazed out over the marsh. She wanted desperately to regain her rosebud frock, and she knew that Elizabeth was starving for further wearing of her poppies. Perhaps the wide, serene plain below inspired her with a hatred of littleness. There would be no loss of dignity in making a proposal that her enemy, she felt sure, would accept. It merely showed a Christian spirit, and set an example to Elizabeth, to make the first move. Janet she did not consider. "If you are in a fit state to listen to reason, Elizabeth," she began. Miss Mapp heaved a sigh of relief. Diva had thought of something. She swallowed the insult at a gulp. "Yes, dear," she said. "Got an idea. Take away Janet's frock and wear it myself. Then you can wear yours. Too pretty for parlour maids, eh?" A heavenly brightness spread over Miss Mapp's face. "Oh, how wonderful of you to have thought of that, Diva," she said. "But how shall we explain it all to everybody?" Diva clung to her rights. Though clearly Christian, she was human. "Say I thought of tacking chintz on, and told you," she said. "Yes, darling," said Elizabeth. "That's beautiful, I agree. But poor Janet." "I'll give her some other old thing," said Diva. "Good sort, Janet. Wants me to win." "And about her having been seen wearing it—" "Say she hasn't ever worn it. Say they're mad," said Diva. Miss Mapp felt it better to tear herself away before she began distilling all sorts of acidities that welled up in her fruitful mind. She could, for instance, easily have agreed that nothing was more probable than that Janet had been mistaken for her mistress. "Au reservoir, then, dear," she said tenderly. "See you at about 4? And will you wear your pretty rosebud frock?" This was agreed to, and Diva went home to take it away from Janet. The reconciliation, of course, was strictly confined to matters relating to chintz, and did not include such extraneous subjects as coal strike or food hoarding, and even in the first glowing moments of restored friendliness, Diva began wondering whether she would have the opportunity that afternoon of testing the truth of her conjecture about the cupboard in the garden-room. Cudgel her brains as she might, she could think of no other cache that could contain the immense amount of provisions that Elizabeth had probably accumulated, and she was all on fire to get to practical grips with the problem. As far as tins of corned beef and tongues went, Elizabeth might possibly have buried them in her garden in the manner of a dog, but it was not likely that a hoarder would limit herself to things in tins. No, there was a cupboard somewhere ready to burst with strong supporting foods. Diva intentionally arrived a full quarter of an hour on the hither side of punctuality, and was taken by Withers out into the garden room, where tea was laid, and 2 card tables were in readiness. She was, of course, the first of the guests, and the moment Withers withdrew to tell her mistress that she had come, Diva stealthily glided to the cupboard, from in front of which the bridge table had been removed, feeling the shrill joy of some romantic treasure hunter. She found the catch, she pressed it, she pulled open the door, and the whole of the damning profusion of provisions burst upon her delighted eyes. Shelf after shelf was crowded with eatables. There were tins of corned beef and tongues. That she knew already. There was a sack of flour. There were tubes of Bath Oliver biscuits, bottles of Bovril, the yield of 1,000 condensed Swiss cows, jars of prunes. All these were in the front row, flush with the door, and who knew to what depth the cupboard extended? Even as she feasted her eyes on this incredible store, some package on the top shelf wavered and toppled, and she had only just time to shut the door again, in order to prevent it falling out onto the floor. But this displacement prevented the door from wholly closing, and push and shove as Diva might, she could not get the catch to click home, and the only result of her energy and efforts was to give rise to a muffled explosion from within, just precisely as if something made of cardboard had burst. That mental image was so vivid that to her fevered imagination it seemed to be real. This was followed by certain faint taps from within, against Elegant Extracts and Astronomy. Diva grew very red in the face, and said, "Drat it," under her breath. She did not dare open the door again in order to push things back, for fear of an uncontrollable stream of things pouring out. Some nicely balanced equilibrium had clearly been upset in those capacious shelves, and it was impossible to tell without looking how deep and how extensive the disturbance was, and in order to look she had to open the bookcase again. Luckily the pressure against the door was not sufficiently heavy to cause it to swing wide, so the best she could do was to leave it, just ajar with temporary quiescence inside. Simultaneously she heard Miss Mapp's step, and had no more than time to trundle at the utmost speed of her whirling feet across to the window, where she stood looking out, and appeared quite unconscious of her hostess's entry. "Diva, darling, how sweet of you to come so early," she said. "A little cosy chat before the others arrive." Diva turned round, much startled. "Hullo," she said. "Didn't hear you. Got Janet's frock, you see." "What makes Diva's face so red?" thought Miss Mapp. "So I see, darling," she said. "Lovely rose garden. How well it suits you, dear. Did Janet mind?" "No. Promised her a new frock at Christmas." "That will be nice for Janet," said Elizabeth enthusiastically. "Shall we pop into the garden, dear, till my guests come?" Diva was glad to pop into the garden and get away from the immediate vicinity of the cupboard, for though she had planned and looked forward to the exposure of Elizabeth's hoarding, she had not meant it to come, as it now probably would, in crashes of tins and bursting of Bovril bottles. Again, she had intended to have opened that door quite casually and innocently while she was being dummy, so that everyone could see how accidental the exposure was, and to have gone poking about the cupboard in Elizabeth's absence was a shade too professional, so to speak, for the usual detective work of Tilling. But the fuse was set now. Sooner or later the explosion must come. She wondered as they went out to commune with Elizabeth's sweet flowers till the other guests arrived, how great a torrent would be let loose. She did not repent her exploration, far from it, but her pleasurable anticipations were strongly diluted with suspense. Miss Mapp had found such difficulty in getting 8 players together today that she had transgressed her principles and asked Mrs. Poppit as well as Isabel, and they, with Diva, the 2 Bartletts, and the Major and the Captain, formed the party. The moment Mrs. Poppit appeared, Elizabeth hated her more than ever, for she put up her glasses and began to give her patronizing advice about her garden, which she had not been allowed to see before. "You have quite a pretty little piece of garden, Miss Mapp," she said, "though, to be sure, I fancied from what you said that it was more extensive. Dear me, your roses do not seem to be doing very well. Probably they are old plants and want renewing. You must send your gardener round. You keep a gardener? And I will let you have a dozen vigorous young bushes." Miss Mapp licked her dry lips. She kept a kind of gardener, 2 days a week. "Too good of you," she said, "but that rose bed is quite sacred, dear Mrs. Poppit. Not all the vigorous young bushes in the world would tempt me. It's my friendship's border. Some dear friend gave me each of my rose trees." Mrs. Poppit transferred her gaze to the wisteria that grew over the steps up to the garden room. Some of the dear friends, she thought, must be centenarians. "Your wisteria wants pruning sadly," she said. "Your gardener does not understand wisterias. That corner there was made, I may say, for fuchsias. You should get a dozen choice fuchsias." Miss Mapp laughed. "Oh, you must excuse me," she said with a glance at Mrs. Poppit's brocaded silk. "I can't bear fuchsias. They always remind me of overdressed women. Ah, there's Mr. Bartlett. How-de-do, Padre, and dear Evie." Dear Evie appeared fascinated by Diva's dress. "Such beautiful rosebuds," she murmured. "And what a lovely shade of purple. And Elizabeth's poppies, too, quite a pair of you. But surely this morning, Diva, didn't I see your good Janet in just such another dress? And I thought at the time how odd it was that—" "If you saw Janet this morning," said Diva quite firmly, "you saw her in her print dress." "And here's Major Benjy," said Miss Mapp, who had made her slip about his Christian name yesterday, and had been duly entreated to continue slipping. "And Captain Puffin. Well, that is nice. Shall we go into my little garden shed, dear Mrs. Poppit, and have our tea?" Major Flint was still a little lame, for his golf today had been of the nature of gardening, and he hobbled up the steps behind the ladies, with that little cock-sparrow sailor following him and telling the Padre how badly and yet how successfully he himself had played. "Pleasantest room in Tilling, I always say, Miss Elizabeth," said he, diverting his mind from a mere game to the fairies. "My dear little room," said Miss Mapp, knowing that it was much larger than anything in Mrs. Poppit's house. "So tiny." "Oh, not a bad-sized little room," said Mrs. Poppit encouragingly. "Much the same proportions on a very small scale as the throne room at Buckingham Palace." "That beautiful throne room!" exclaimed Miss Mapp. "A cup of tea, dear Mrs. Poppit? None of that naughty red-currant fool, I am afraid. And a little chocolate cake?" These substantial chocolate cakes soon did their fell work of producing the sense of surfeit, and presently Elizabeth's guests dropped off gorged from the tea-table. Diva fortunately remembered their consistency in time, and nearly cleared a plate of jumbles instead, which the hostess had hoped would form a pleasant accompaniment to her dessert at her supper this evening, and was still crashingly engaged on them when the general drifting movement towards the 2 bridge tables set in. Mrs. Poppit, with her glasses up, followed by Isabel, was employed in making a tour of the room, in case, as Miss Mapp had already determined, she never saw it again, examining the quality of the carpet, the curtains, the chair-backs, with the air of a doubtful purchaser. "And quite a quantity of books, I see," she announced as she came opposite the fatal cupboard. "Look, Isabel, what a quantity of books! There's something strange about them, though. I do not believe they are real." She put out her hand and pulled at the back of one of the volumes of Elegant Extracts. The door swung open, and from behind it came a noise of rattling, bumping, and clattering. Something soft and heavy thumped on to the floor, and a cloud of flowery dust arose. A bottle of Bovril embedded itself quietly there without damage, and a tin of Bath Oliver biscuits beat a fierce tattoo on one of corned beef. Innumerable dried apricots from the burst package flew about like shrapnel and tapped at the tins. A jar of prunes, breaking its fall on the flour, rolled merrily out into the middle of the floor. The din was succeeded by complete silence. The Padre had said, "What ho, i'fegs!" during the tumult, but his voice had been drowned by the rattling of the dried apricots. The member of the Order of the British Empire stepped free of the provisions that bumped round her, and examined them through her glasses. Diva crammed the last jumble into her mouth, and disposed of it with the utmost rapidity. The birthday of her life had come, as Miss Rossetti said. "Dear Elizabeth!" she exclaimed. "What a disaster! All your little stores in case of the coal strike. Let me help to pick them up. I do not think anything is broken. Isn't that lucky?" Evie hurried to the spot. "Such a quantity of good things," she said rapidly, under her breath. "Tinned meats and Bovril and prunes, and ever so many apricots. Let me pick them all up, and with a little dusting... Why, what a big cupboard! And such a quantity of good things!" Miss Mapp had certainly struck a streak of embarrassments. What with naked Mr. Hopkins, and Janet's frock, and this unveiling of her hoard, life seemed at the moment really to consist of nothing else than beastly situations. How on earth that catch of the door had come undone she had no idea, but much as she would have liked to suspect foul play from somebody, she was bound to conclude that Mrs. Poppit with her prying hands had accidentally pressed it. It was like Diva, of course, to break the silence with odious allusions to hoarding, and bitterly she wished that she had not started the topic the other day, but had been content to lay in her stores without so pointedly affirming that she was doing nothing of the kind. But this was no time for vain laments, and restraining a natural impulse to scratch and beat Mrs. Poppit, she exhibited an admirable inventiveness and composure. Though she knew it would deceive nobody, everybody had to pretend he was deceived. "Oh, my poor little Christmas presents for your needy parishioners, Padre," she said. "You've seen them before you were meant to, and you must forget all about them. And so little harm done, just an apricot or two. Withers will pick them all up, so let us get to our bridge." Withers entered the room at this moment to clear away tea, and Miss Mapp explained it all over again. "All our little Christmas presents have come tumbling out, Withers," she said. "Will you put as many as you can back in the cupboard, and take the rest indoors? Don't tread on the apricots." It was difficult to avoid doing this, as the apricots were everywhere, and their colour on the brown carpet was wonderfully protective. Miss Mapp herself had already stepped on 2, and their adhesive stickiness was hard to get rid of. In fact, for the next few minutes the coal shovel was in strong request for their removal from the soles of shoes, and the fender was littered with their squashed remains. The party generally was distinctly thoughtful as it sorted itself out into 2 tables, for every single member of it was trying to assimilate the amazing proposition that Miss Mapp had, halfway through September, loaded her cupboard with Christmas presents on a scale that staggered belief. The feat required thought. It required a faith so childlike as to verge on the imbecile. Conversation during deals had an awkward tendency towards discussion of the coal strike. As often as it drifted there, the subject was changed very abruptly, just as if there was some occult reason for not speaking of so natural a topic. It concerned everybody, but it was rightly felt to concern Miss Mapp the most. End of chapter 4. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on October 13th, 2008, in San Diego, California.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kelsey Molyneux. Miss Mapp by E.F. Benson. Chapter 5, Part 1. It was the Major's turn to entertain his friend, and by 9:30, on a certain squally October evening, he and Puffin were seated by the fire in the diary room, while the rain volleyed at the windows and occasional puffs of stinging smoke were driven down the chimney by the gale that squealed and buffeted round the house. Puffin, by way of keeping up the comedy of Roman roads, had brought a map of the district across from his house, but the more essential part of his equipment for this studious evening was a bottle of whiskey. Originally the host had provided whiskey for himself and his guest at these pleasant chats, but there were undeniable objections to this plan, because the guest always proved unusually thirsty, which tempted his host to keep pace with him, while if they both drank at their own expense, the causes of economy and abstemiousness had a better chance. Also, while the Major took his drinks short and strong in a tumbler, Puffin enriched his with lemons and sugar in a large one, so that nobody could really tell if equality as well as fraternity was realized, but if each brought his own bottle. It had been a trying day, and the Major was very lame. A drenching storm had come up during their golf, while they were far from the clubhouse, and Puffin, being 3 up, had naturally refused to accede to his opponent's suggestion to call the match off. He was perfectly willing to be paid his half-crown and go home, but Major Flint, remembering that Puffin's game usually went to pieces if it rained, had rejected this proposal with the scorn that it deserved. There had been other disagreeable incidents as well. His driver, slippery from rain, had flown out of the Major's hands on the 12th tee, and had shot like a streamer of the northern morn, and landed in a pool of brackish water left by an unusually high tide. The ball had gone into another pool nearer the tree. The ground was greasy with moisture, and 3 holes farther on, Puffin had fallen flat on his face instead of lashing his 5th shot home onto the green, as he had intended. They had given each other stymies, and each had holed his opponent's ball by mistake. They had wrangled over the correct procedure if you lay in a rabbit scrape or on the tram lines. The Major had lost a new ball. There was a mushroom on one of the greens between Puffin's ball and the hole. All these untoward incidents had come crowding in together, and from the Major's point of view, the worst of them all had been the collective incident that Puffin, so far from being put off by the rain, had, in spite of mushroom and falling down, played with a steadiness of which he was usually quite incapable. Consequently, Major Flint was lame, and his wound troubled him, while Puffin, in spite of his obvious reasons for complacency, was growing irritated with his companion's ill temper, and was half blinded by wood smoke. He wiped his streaming eyes. "You should get your chimney swept," he observed. Major Flint had put his handkerchief over his face to keep the wood smoke out of his eyes. He blew it off with a loud, indignant puff. "Oh, ha! Indeed!" he said. Puffin was rather taken aback by the violence of these interjections. They dripped with angry sarcasm. "Oh, well, no offence," he said. "A man," said the Major impersonally, "makes an offensive remark, and says no offence. If your own fireside suits you better than mine, Captain Puffin, all I can say is that you are at liberty to enjoy it." This was all rather irregular. They had indulged in a good stiff breeze this afternoon, and it was too early to ruffle the calm again. Puffin plucked and proffered an olive branch. "There's your handkerchief," he said, picking it up. "Now let's have one of our comfortable talks. Hot glass of grog and a chat over the fire. That's the best thing after such a wetting as we got this afternoon. I'll take a slice of lemon, if you'll be so good as to give it to me, and a lump of sugar." The Major got up and limped to his cupboard. It struck him precisely at that moment that Puffin scored considerably over lemons and sugar, because he was supplied with them gratis every other night, whereas he himself, when Puffin's guest, took nothing off his host but hot water. He determined to ask for some biscuits anyhow, tomorrow. "I hardly know whether there's a lemon left," he grumbled. "I must lay in a store of lemons. As for sugar—" Puffin chose to disregard this suggestion. "Amusing incident the other day," he said brightly, "when Miss Mapp's cupboard door flew open. The old lady didn't like it. Don't suppose the poor of the parish will see much of that corned beef." The Major became dignified. "Pardon me," he said. "When an esteemed friend like Miss Elizabeth tells me that certain provisions are destined for the poor of the parish, I take it that her statement is correct. I expect others of my friends, while they are in my presence, to do the same. I have the honour to give you a lemon, Captain Puffin, and a slice of sugar. I should say a lump of sugar. Pray, make yourself comfortable." This dignified and lofty mood was often one of the after-effects of an unsuccessful game of golf. It generally yielded quite quickly to a little stimulant. Puffin filled his glass from the bottle and the kettle, while his friend put his handkerchief again over his face. "Well, I shall just have my grog before I turn in," he observed, according to custom. "Aren't you going to join me, Major?" "Presently, sir," said the Major. Puffin knocked out the consumed cinders in his pipe against the edge of the fender. Major Flint apparently was waiting for this, for he withdrew his handkerchief and closely watched the process. A minute piece of ash fell from Puffin's pipe onto the hearth-rug, and he jumped to his feet and removed it very carefully with a shovel. "I have your permission, I hope," he said witheringly. "Certainly, certainly," said Puffin. "Now get your glass, Major. You'll feel better in a minute or two." Major Flint would have liked to have kept up this magnificent attitude, but the smell of Puffin's steaming glass beat dignity down, and after glaring at him, he limped back to the cupboard for his whiskey bottle. He gave a lamentable cry when he beheld it. "But I got that bottle in only the day before yesterday," he shouted, "and there's hardly a drink left in it." "Well, you did yourself pretty well last night," said Puffin. "Those small glasses of yours, if frequently filled up, empty a bottle quicker than you seem to realise." Motives of policy prevented the Major from receiving this with the resentment that was proper to it, and his face cleared. He would get quits over these incessant lemons and lumps of sugar. "Well, you'll have to let me borrow from you tonight," he said genially, as he poured the rest of the contents of his bottle into the glass. "Ah, that's more the ticket. A glass of whiskey a day keeps the doctor away." The prospect of sponging on Puffin was most exhilarating, and he put his large slippered feet on to the fender. "Yes, indeed, that was a highly amusing incident about Miss Mapp's cupboard," he said. "And wasn't Miss Plasto down on her like a knife about it? Our fair friends, you know, have a pretty sharp eye for each other's little failings. They've no sooner finished one squabble than they begin another, the pert little fairies. They can't sit and enjoy themselves like two old cronies I could tell you of, and feel at peace with all the world." He finished his glass at a gulp, and seemed much surprised to find it empty. "I'll be borrowing a drop from you, old friend," he said. "Help yourself, Major," said Puffin, with a keen eye as to how much he took. "Very obliging of you. I feel as if I caught a bit of a chill this afternoon. My wound." "Be careful not to inflame it," said Puffin. "Thank ye for the warning. It's this beastly climate that touches it up. A winter in England adds years onto a man's life unless he takes care of himself. Take care of yourself, old boy. Have some more sugar." Before long the Major's hand was moving slowly and instinctively towards Puffin's whiskey bottle again. "I reckon that big glass of yours, Puffin," he said, "holds between 3½ times to 4 times what my little tumbler holds. Between 3½ and 4, I should reckon. I may be wrong." "Reckoning the water in, I daresay you're not far out, Major," said he, "and according to my estimate you mix your drink somewhere about 3½ times to 4 stronger than I mix mine." "Oh, come, come," said the Major. 3½ to 4 times. I should say," repeated Puffin. "You won't find I'm far out." He replenished his tumbler, and instead of putting the bottle back on the table, absently deposited it on the floor on the far side of his chair. This second tumbler usually marked the most convivial period of the evening, for the first would have healed whatever unhappy discords had marred the harmony of the day, and, those being disposed of, they very contentedly talked through their hats about past prowesses, and took a rosy view of the youth and energy which still beat in their vigorous pulses. They would begin, perhaps, by extolling each other. Puffin, when informed that his friend would be 54 next birthday, flatly refused, without offence, to believe it, and, indeed, he was quite right in doing so, because the Major was in reality 56. In turn, Major Flint would say that his friend had the figure of a boy of 20, which caused Puffin presently to feel a little cramped and to wander negligently in front of the big looking-glass between the windows, and find this compliment much easier to swallow than the Major's age. For the next half hour they would chiefly talk about themselves in a pleasant glow of self-satisfaction. Major Flint, looking at the various implements and trophies that adorned the room, would suggest putting a sporting challenge in the Times. "'Pon my word, Puffin," he said, "I've half a mind to do it. Retired Major of His Majesty's Forces, the King, God bless him," and he took a substantial sip. "Retired Major, aged 54, challenges any gentleman of 50 years or over." 40, said Puffin sycophantically, as he thought over what he would say about himself when the old man had finished. "Well, we'll have it. We'll say 45, to please you, Puffin. Let's see, where had I got to? Retired Major challenges any gentleman of 45 years or over to a shooting match in the morning, followed by half a dozen rounds with 4-ounce gloves, a game of golf, 18 holes, in the afternoon, and a billiards match of 200 up after tea. Ha ha! I shouldn't feel much anxiety as to the result." "My confounded leg," said Puffin. "But I know a retired captain from His Majesty's Merchant Service, the King, God bless him, aged 50... "Ho ho! 50 indeed!" said the Major, thinking to himself that a dried-up little man like Puffin might be as old as an Egyptian mummy. Who can tell the age of a kipper? "Not a day less, Major. Retired captain, aged 50, will take on all comers of 42 and over at a steeplechase, round of golf, billiards match, hopping match, gymnastic competition, swinging Italian clubs. No objection, gentlemen? Then carried mem. Con. This gaseous mood, athletic, amatory or otherwise, the amatory ones were the worst, usually faded slowly, like the light from the setting sun or an exhausted coal in the grate, about the end of Puffin's second tumbler, and the gentlemen after that were usually somnolent, but occasionally laid the foundation for some disagreement next day, which they were too sleepy to go into now. Major Flint, by this time, would have had some 5 small glasses of whisky, equivalent, as he bitterly observed, to 1 in pre-war days, and as he measured his next with extreme care and a slightly jerky movement, would announce it as being his nightcap, though you would have thought he had plenty of nightcaps on already. Puffin correspondingly took a thimbleful more, the thimble apparently belonging to some housewife of Anak, and after another half-hour of sudden single snores and startings awake again, of pipes frequently lit and immediately going out, the guest, still perfectly capable of coherent speech and voluntary motion in the required direction, would stumble across the dark cobbles to his house, and doors would be very carefully closed for fear of attracting the attention of the old lady, who at this period of the evening was usually known as Old Mappy. The two were perfectly well aware of the sympathetic interest that Old Mappy took in all that concerned them, and that she had an eye on their evening seances was evidenced by the frequency with which the corner of her blind in the window of the garden-room was raised between, say, 9:30 and 11 at night. They had often watched with giggles the pencil of light that escaped, obscured at the lower end by the outline of Old Mappy's head, and occasionally drank to the guardian angel. Guardian Angel, in answer to direct inquiries, had been told by Major Benjy during the last month that he worked at his diaries on 3 nights in the week, and went to bed early on the others, to the vast improvement of his mental grasp. "And on Saturday night, dear Major Benjy?" asked Old Mappy in the character of Guardian Angel. "I don't think you knew my beloved, my reverend mother, Miss Elizabeth," said Major Benjy. "I spend Sunday evening as... well... The very next Sunday evening Guardian Angel had heard the sounds of singing. She could not catch the words, and only fragments of the tune, which reminded her of "The roseate morn hath passed away." Brimming with emotion, she sang it softly to herself as she undressed, and blamed herself very much for ever having thought that dear Major Benjy. She peeped out of her window when she had extinguished her light, but fortunately the singing had ceased. Tonight, however, the epoch of Puffin's second big tumbler was not accompanied by harmonious developments. Major Benjy was determined to make the most of this unique opportunity of drinking his friend's whisky, and whether Puffin put the bottle on the farther side of him, or under his chair, or under the table, he came padding round in his slippers and standing near the ambush while he tried to interest his friend in the tales of love or tiger, shooting so as to distract his attention. When he mistakenly thought he had done so, he hastily refilled his glass, taking unusually stiff doses for fear of not getting another opportunity, and altogether omitting to ask Puffin's leave for these maraudings. When this had happened 4 or 5 times, Puffin, acting on the instinct of the polar bear who eats her babies for fear that anybody else should get them, surreptitiously poured the rest of his bottle into his glass, and filled it up to the top with hot water, making a mixture of extraordinary power. Soon after this Major Flint came rambling around the table again. He was not sure whether Puffin had put the bottle by his chair or behind the coal scuttle, and was quite ignorant of the fact that wherever it was empty. Amorous reminiscences to-night had been the accompaniment to Puffin's second tumbler. "Devilish fine woman she was," he said, "and that was the last Benjamin Flint ever saw of her. She went up to the hills next morning." "But the last you saw of her just now was on the deck of the P. and O. at Bombay," objected Puffin. "Or did she go up to the hills on the deck of the P. and O.? Wonderful line." "No, sir," said Benjamin Flint, "that was Helen. La belle Hélène. It was La belle Hélène whom I saw off at the Apollo Bunder. I don't know if I told you. By gad, I've kicked the bottle over. No idea you'd put it there. Hope the cork's in." "No harm if it isn't," said Puffin, beginning on his third most fiery glass. The strength of it rather astonished him. "You don't mean to say it's empty?" asked Major Flint. "Why, just now there was close on 1/4 of the bottle left." "As much as that?" asked Puffin. "Glad to hear it." "Not a drop less. You don't mean to say... Well, if you can drink that and can say hippopotamus afterwards, I should put that among your challenges to men of 402. I should say 42. It's a fine thing to have a strong head, though if I drank what you've got in your glass, I should be tipsy, sir." Puffin laughed in his irritating falsetto manner. "Good thing that it's in my glass, then, and not your glass," he said. "And let me tell you, Major, in case you don't know it, that when I've drunk every drop of this and sucked the lemon, you'll have had far more out of my bottle this evening than I have. My usual twice, and my usual nightcap, as you say, is what's my ration, and I've had no more than my ration, 8 bells." "And a pretty good ration you've got there," said the baffled Major, "without your usual twice." Puffin was beginning to be aware of that as he swallowed the fiery mixture, but nothing in the world would now have prevented his drinking every single drop of it. It was clear to him, among so much that was dim owing to the wood smoke, that the Major would miss a good many drives tomorrow morning. "And whose whiskey is it?" he said, gulping down the fiery stuff. "I know whose it's going to be," said the other. "And I know whose it is now," retorted Puffin. "And I know whose whiskey it is that's filled you up tight as a drum," he repeated very carefully. Major Flint was conscious of an unusual activity of brain, and, when he spoke, of a sort of congestion and entanglement of words. It pleased him to think that he had drunk so much of somebody else's whiskey, but he felt that he ought to be angry. "That's a very unmentionable sort of thing to say," he remarked, "and if it wasn't for the sacred claims of hospitality, I'd make you explain just what you mean by that, and make you eat your words, apologise, in fact." Puffin finished his glass at a gulp, and rose to his feet. "'Pologies be blowed," he said. "Hippopotamus." "And you were addressing that to me?" asked Major Flint with deadly calm. "Of course I was. Same animal as before. Pleasant old boy. And as for the lemon you lent me, well, I don't want it any more. Have a suck at it, old fellow. I don't want it any more." The Major turned purple in the face, made a course for the door, like a knight's move at chess, a long step in one direction and a short one at right angles to the first, and opened it. The door thus served as an aperture from the room and a support to himself. He spoke no word of any sort of kind. His silence spoke for him in a far more dignified manner than he could have managed for himself. Captain Puffin stood for a moment wreathed in smiles, and fingering the slice of lemon which he had meant playfully to throw at his friend. But his smile faded, and by some sort of telepathic perception he realised how much more decorous it was to say, or better, to indicate, good night in a dignified manner than to throw lemons about. He walked in dots and dashes like a Morse code out of the room, bestowing a naval salute on the Major as he passed. The latter returned it with a military salute and a suppressed hiccup. Not a word passed. Then Captain Puffin found his hat and coat without much difficulty, and marched out of the house, slamming the door behind him with a bang that echoed down the street and made Miss Mapp dream about a thunderstorm. He let himself into his own house, and bent down before his expired fire, which he tried to blow into life again. This was unsuccessful, and he breathed in a quantity of wood ash. He sat down by his table and began to think things out. He told himself that he was not drunk at all, but that he had taken an unusual quantity of whiskey, which seemed to produce much the same effect as intoxication. Allowing for that, he was conscious that he was extremely angry about something, and had a firm idea that the Major was very angry too. "But what's it all been about?" he vainly asked himself. "What's it all been about?" He was roused from his puzzling over this unanswerable conundrum by the clink of the flap in his letter box. Either this was the first post in the morning, in which case it was much later than he had thought, and wonderfully still dark, or it was the last post at night, in which case it was much earlier than he thought. But, whichever it was, a letter had been slipped into his box, and he brought it in. The gum on the envelope was still wet, which saved trouble in opening it. Inside was a half sheet, containing but a few words. This curt epistle ran as follows: "Sir, my seconds will wait on you in the course of tomorrow morning. Your faithful, obedient servant, Benjamin Flint, Captain Puffin." Puffin felt as calm as a tropic night, and as courageous as a captain. Somewhere below his courage and his calm was an appalling sense of misgiving. That he successfully stifled. "Very proper," he said. "Quite proper. Insults, blood, seconds won't have to wait a second. Better get a good sleep." He went up to his room, fell into his bed, and instantly began to snore. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kelsey Molyneux. Miss Mapp by E. F. Benson. Chapter 5, Part 2. It was still dark when he awoke, but the square of his window was visible against the blackness, and he concluded that though it was not morning yet, it was getting on for morning, which seemed a pity. As he turned over onto his side, his hand came in contact with his coat, instead of a sheet, and he became aware that he had all his clothes on. Then, as with a crash of cymbals and the beating of a drum in his brain, the events of the evening before leaped into reality and significance. In a few hours now, arrangements would have been made for a deadly encounter. His anger was gone, his whiskey was gone, and in particular his courage was gone. He expressed all this compendiously by moaning, "Oh, God!" He struggled to a sitting position, and lit a match at which he kindled his candle. He looked for his watch beside it, but it was not there. What could have happened? Then he remembered that it was in its accustomed place in his waistcoat pocket. A consultation of it, followed by holding it to his ear, only revealed the fact that it had stopped at 5:30. With the lucidity that was growing brighter in his brain, he concluded that this stoppage was due to the fact that he had not wound it up. It was after 5:30 then, but how much later only the lords of time knew. Time which bordered so closely on eternity. He felt that he had no use whatever for eternity, but that he must not waste time. Just now, that was far more precious. From somewhere in the cosmic consciousness there came to him a thought, namely, that the first train to London started at 6:30 in the morning. It was a slow train, but it got there, and in any case it went away from Tilling. He did not trouble to consider how that thought came to him. The important point was that it had come. Coupled with that was the knowledge that it was now an undiscoverable number of minutes after 5:30. There was a Gladstone bag under his bed. He had brought it back from the clubhouse only yesterday after that game of golf which had been so full of disturbances and wet stockings, but which now wore the shimmering security of peaceful, tranquil days long past. How little, so he thought to himself, as he began swiftly storing shirts, ties, collars, and other useful things into his bag, had he appreciated the sweet amenities of life, its pleasant conversations and companionships, its topped drives, and mushrooms and incalculable incidents. Now they wore a glamour and a preciousness that was bound up with life itself. He starved for more of them, not knowing while they were his how sweet they were. The house was not yet astir, when 10 minutes later he came downstairs with his bag. He left on his sitting-room table, where it would catch the eye of his housemaid, a sheet of paper on which he wrote "Called away." He shuddered as he traced the words. Forward no letters. Will communicate. Somehow the telegraphic form seemed best to suit the urgency of the situation. Then very quietly he let himself out of his house. He could not help casting an apprehensive glance at the windows of his quondam friend and prospective murderer. To his horror he observed that there was a light behind the blind of the Major's bedroom, and pictured him writing to his seconds. He wondered who the seconds were going to be, or polishing up his pistols. All the rumours and hints of the Major's duels and affairs of honour which he had rather scorned before, not wholly believing them, poured like a red torrent into his mind, and he found that now he believed them with a passionate sincerity. Why had he ever attempted, and with such small success, to call this fire-eater a hippopotamus? The gale of the night before had abated, and thick chilly rain was falling from the sullen sky as he tiptoed down the hill. Once around the corner, and out of sight of the duellist's house, he broke into a limping run which was accelerated by the sound of an engine whistle from the station. It was mental suspense of the most agonizing kind not to know how long it was after his watch had stopped that he had awoke, and the sound of that whistle, followed by several short puffs of steam, might prove to be the 6:30 bearing away to London, on business or pleasure, its secure and careless pilgrims. Splashing through puddles, lopsidedly weighted by his bag, with his mackintosh flapping around his legs, he gained the sanctuary of the waiting-room and booking-office, which was lighted by a dim expiring lamp, and scrutinized the face of the murky clock. With a sob of relief he saw that he was in time. He was, indeed, in exceptionally good time, for he had a quarter of an hour to wait. An anxious internal debate followed as to whether or not he should take a return ticket. Optimism, that is to say, the hope that he would return to Tilling in peace and safety before the 6 months for which the ticket was available inclined him to the larger expense. But in these disquieting circumstances it was difficult to be optimistic, and he purchased a first-class single, for on such a morning and on such a journey he must get what comfort he could from looking-glasses, padded seats, and coloured photographs of places of interest on the line. He formed no vision at all of the future. That was a dark well into which it was dangerous to peer. There was no bright speck in its unplumable depths. Unless Major Flint died suddenly without revealing the challenge he had sent last night, and the promptitude with which its recipient had disappeared rather than face his pistol, he could not frame any grouping of events which would make it possible for him to come back to Tilling again, for he would either have to fight, and this he was quite determined not to do, or be pointed at by the finger of scorn as the man who would refuse to do so, and this was nearly as unthinkable as the other. Bitterly he blamed himself for having made a friend, and worse that, an enemy, of one so obsolete and old-fashioned as to bring duelling into modern life. As far as he could be glad of anything, he was glad that he had taken a single, not a return ticket. He turned his eyes away from the blackness of the future and let his mind dwell on the hardly less murky past. Then, throwing up his hands, he buried his face in them with a hollow groan. By some miserable forgetfulness, he had left the challenge on his chimney-piece, where his housemaid would undoubtedly find and read it. That would explain his absence far better than the telegraphic instructions he had left on his table. There was no time to go back for it now, even if he could have faced the risk of being seen by the Major, and in an hour or two the whole story, by Withers, Janet, etc., would be all over Tilling. It was no use then thinking of the future nor of the past, and in order to anchor himself to the world at all and preserve his sanity, he had to confine himself to the present. The minutes, long though each tarried, were slipping away, and provided his train was punctual, the passage of 5 more of these laggards would see him safe. The newsboy took down the shutters of his stall, a porter quenched the expiring lamp, and Puffin began to listen for the rumble of the approaching train. It stayed 3 minutes here. If up to time, it would be in before a couple more minutes had passed. There came from the station yard outside the sound of heavy footsteps running. Some early traveller like himself was afraid of missing the train. The door burst open, and streaming with rain and panting for breath, Major Flint stood at the entry. Puffin looked wildly round to see whether he could escape, still perhaps unobserved, onto the platform, but it was too late, for their eyes met. In that instant of abject terror, 2 things struck Puffin. One was that the Major looked at the open door behind him as if meditating retreat, the second that he carried a Gladstone bag. Simultaneously Major Flint spoke, if indeed that reverberating thunder of scornful indignation can be called speech. "Ha! I guessed right then," he roared. "I guessed, sir, that you might be meditating flight, and in fact, I came down to see whether you were running away. I was right. You are a coward, Captain Puffin, but relieve your mind, sir. Major Flint will not demean himself to fight with a coward." Puffin gave one long sigh of relief, and then, standing in front of his own Gladstone bag, in order to conceal it, burst into a cackling laugh. "Indeed," he said, "and why, Major, was it necessary for you to pack a Gladstone bag in order to stop me from running away? I'll tell you what has happened. You were running away, and you know it. I guessed you would. I came to stop you, you quaking runaway. Your wound troubled you, hey? Didn't want another, hey?" There was an awful pause, broken by the entry from behind the Major of the outside porter, panting under the weight of a large portmanteau. "You'd had to take your portmanteau too," observed Puffin witheringly, "in order to stop me? That's a curious way of stopping me. You're a coward, sir, but go home. You're safe enough. This'll be a fine story for tea parties." Puffin turned from him in scorn, still concealing his own bag. Unfortunately, the flap of his coat caught it, precariously perched on the bench, and it bumped to the ground. "What's that?" said Major Flint. They stared at each other for a moment, and then simultaneously burst into peals of laughter. The train rumbled slowly into the station, but neither took the least notice of it, and only shook their heads and broke out again when the station-master urged them to take their seats. The only thing that had power to restore Captain Puffin to gravity was the difficulty of getting the money for his ticket refunded, while the departure of the train with his portmanteau in it did the same for the Major. The events of that night and morning, as may easily be imagined, soon supplied Tilling with one of the most remarkable conundrums that had ever been forced upon its notice. Puffin's housemaid, during his absence at the station, found and read not only the notice intended for her eyes, but the challenge which he had left on the chimney-piece. She conceived it to be her duty to take it down to Miss Gashly, his cook, and while they were putting the bloodiest construction on these inscriptions, their conference was interrupted by the return of Captain Puffin in the highest spirits, who, after a vain search for the challenge, was quite content, as its purport was no longer fraught with danger and death, to suppose that he had torn it up. Mrs. Gashly, therefore, after preparing breakfast at this unusually early hour, went across to the back door of the Major's house, with the challenging in her hand, to borrow a nutmeg grater, and gleaned the information that Mrs. Dominick's employer, for master he could not be called, had gone off in a great hurry to the station early that morning with a Gladstone bag and a portmanteau, the latter of which had been seen no more, though the Major had returned. So Mrs. Gashly produced the challenge, and having watched Miss Mapp off to the High Street at 10:30, Dominic and Gashly went together to her house to see if Withers could supply anything of importance, or, if not, a nutmeg grater. They were forced to be content with the grater, but pored over the challenge with Withers, and she, having an errand to Diva's house, told Janet, who without further ceremony bounded upstairs to tell her mistress. Hardly had Diva heard that she plunged into the high street, and with suitable additions told Miss Mapp, Evie, Irene, and the Padre under promise in each case of the strictest secrecy. 10 minutes later, Irene had asked of the defenceless Mr. Hopkins, who was being at him again, what he knew about it, and Evie, with her mouse-like gait that looked so rapid and was so deliberate, had the mortification of seeing Miss Mapp outdistance her and be admitted into the Poppets' house just as she came in view of the front door. She rightly conjectured that, after the affair of the store cupboard in the garden room, there could be nothing of lesser importance than the duel, which could take that lady through those abhorred portals. Finally, at 10 minutes past 11, Major Flint and Captain Puffin were seen by one or two fortunate people, the morning having cleared up, walking together to the tram, and without exception everybody knew that they were on their way to fight their duel in some remote hollow of the sand dunes. Miss Mapp had gone straight home from her visit to the Poppets just about 11, and stationed herself in the window where she could keep an eye on the houses of the duellists. In her anxiety to outstrip Evie and be the first to tell the Poppets, she had not waited to hear that they had both come back and knew only of the challenge and that they had gone to the station. She had already formed a glorious idea of her own as to what the history of the duel, past or future, was, and, intoxicated with emotion, had retired from the wordy fray to think about it, and, as already mentioned, to keep an eye on the two houses just below. Then there appeared in sight the Padre, walking swiftly up the hill, and she had barely time under cover of the curtain to regain the table where her sweet chrysanthemums were pining for water when Withers announced him. He wore a furrowed brow and quite forgot to speak either Scotch or Elizabethan English. A few rapid words made it clear that they both had heard the main outlines. "A terrible situation," said the Padre. "Duelling is in direct contravention of all Christian principles and, I believe, of the civil law. The discharge of a pistol in unskilful hands may lead to deplorable results, and Major Flint, so one has heard, is an experienced duellist. That, of course, makes it even more dangerous." It was at this identical moment that Major Flint came out of his house, and qui-hied cheerily to Puffin. Miss Mapp and the Padre, deep in these bloody possibilities, neither saw nor heard them. They passed together down the road and into High Street, unconscious that their every look and action was being more commented on than the epistle to the Hebrews. Inside the garden room, Miss Mapp sighed and bent her eyes on her chrysanthemums. "Quite terrible," she said, "and in our peaceful, tranquil Tilling." "Perhaps the duel has already taken place, and they've missed," said the Padre. "They were both seen to return to their houses early this morning." "By whom?" asked Miss Mapp jealously. She had not heard that. "By Hopkins," said he. "Hopkins saw them both return." "I shouldn't trust that man too much," said Miss Mapp. "Hopkins may not be telling the truth. I have no great opinion of his moral standard." "Why is that?" This was no time to discuss the nudity of Hopkins, and Miss Mapp put the question aside. "That does not matter now, dear Padre," she said. "I only wish I thought the duel had taken place without accident. But Major Flint's portmanteau has not come back to his house. Of that I'm sure. What if they've sent it away to some place where they are unknown, full of pistols and things?" "Possible. Terribly possible," said the Padre. "I wish I could see my duty clear. I should not hesitate to do the best I could induce them to abandon the murderous project. And what do you imagine was the root of the quarrel?" "I couldn't say, I'm sure," said Miss Mapp. She bent her head over the chrysanthemums. "Your distracting sex," said he with a moment's gallantry, "is quite the cause of the quarrel. I've noticed that they both seem to admire Miss Irene very much." Miss Mapp raised her head and spoke with great animation. "Dear quaint Irene, I'm sure it has nothing whatever to do with it," she said with the perfect truth. "Nothing whatever!" There was no mistaking the sincerity of this, and the Padre, Tillingite to the marrow, instantly concluded that Miss Mapp knew what, or who, was the cause of all this unique disturbance, and as she bent her head again over the chrysanthemums and quite distinctly grew brick red in the face, he felt that delicacy prevented his inquiring any further. "What are you going to do, dear Padre?" she asked in a low voice choking with emotion. "Whatever you decide will be wise and Christian. Oh, these violent men! Such babies, too!" The Padre was bursting with curiosity, but since his delicacy forbade him to ask any of the questions which effervesced like sherbet around his tongue, he propounded another plan. "I think my duty is to go straight to the Major," he said, "who seems to be the principal in the affair, and tell him that I know all, and guess the rest," he added. "Nothing that I have said," declared Miss Mapp in great confusion, "must have anything to do with your guesses. Promise me that, Padre." This intimate and fruitful conversation was interrupted by the sound of 2 pairs of steps just outside, and before Withers had time to say "Mrs. Plastow," Diva burst in. "They have both taken the 11:20 tram," she said, and sank into the nearest chair. "Together?" asked Miss Mapp, feeling a sudden chill of disappointment at the thought of a duel with pistols trailing off into one with golf clubs. "Yes, but that's a blind," panted Diva. "They were talking and laughing together. Sheer blind. Duel among the sand dunes." "Padre, it is your duty to stop it," said Miss Mapp faintly. "But if the pistols are in the portmanteau," he began. "What portmanteau?" screamed Diva, who hadn't heard about that. "Darling, I'll tell you presently," said Miss Mapp. "That was only a guess of mine, Padre, but there's no time to lose." "But there's no tram to catch," said the Padre. "It has gone by this time." "A taxi then, Padre. Oh, lose no time." "Are you coming with me?" he said in a low voice. "Your presence—" "Better not," she said. "It might—" "Better not," she repeated. He skipped down the steps and was observed running down the street. "What about the portmanteau?" asked the greedy Diva. It was with strong misgivings that the Padre started on his Christian errand, and had not the sense of adventure spiced it, he would have probably returned to his sermon instead, which was Christian too. To begin with, there was the ruinous expense of taking a taxi out to the golf links, but by no other means could he hope to arrive in time to avert an encounter that might be fatal. It must be said to his credit that, though this was an errand distinctly due to his position as the spiritual head of Tilling, he rejected, as soon as it occurred to him, the idea of charging the hire of the taxi to church expenses, and as he whirled along the flat road across the marsh, the thing which chiefly buoyed up his drooping spirits and annealed his courage was the romantic nature of his mission. He no longer, thanks to what Miss Mapp had so clearly refrained from saying, he had the slightest doubt that she, in some manner that scarcely needed conjecture, was the cause of the duel he was attempting to avert. For years it had been a matter of unwearied and confidential discussion as to whether and when she would marry either Major Flint or Captain Puffin, and it was superfluous to look for any other explanation. It was true that she, in popular parlance, was "getting on," but so, too, and at exactly the same rate, were the representatives of the United Services, and the sooner that 2 of the 3 of them got on permanently the better. No doubt some crisis had arisen, and inflamed with love, he intended to confide all this to his wife on his return. On his return! The unspoken words made his heart sink. What if he never did return? For he was about to place himself in a position of no common danger. His plan was to drive past the clubhouse, and then on foot, after discharging the taxi, to strike directly into the line of tumbled sand dunes which, remote and undisturbed, and full of large convenient hollows, stretched along the coast and above the flat beach. Any of those hollows, he knew, might prove to contain the duellists in the very act of firing, and over the rim of each he had to pop his unprotected head. He, if in time, would have to separate the combatants, and who knew whether, in their very natural chagrin at being interrupted, they might not turn their combined pistols on him first, and settle with each other afterwards. One murder the more made little difference to desperate men. Other shocks, less deadly but extremely unnerving, might await him. He might be too late, and pop his head over the edge of one of these craters only to discover it full of bleeding if not mangled bodies. Or there might be only one mangled body, and the other, unmangled, would pursue him through the sand dunes and offer him life at the price of silence. That, he painfully reflected, would be a very difficult decision to make. Luckily, Captain Puffin, if he proved to be the survivor, was lame. With a drawn face and agonized prayers on his lips, he began a systematic search of the sand dunes. Often his nerve nearly failed him, and he would sink panting among the prickly bents before he dared to peer into the hollow up the sides of which he had climbed. His ears shuddered at the anticipation of hearing from near at hand the report of pistols, and once a backfire from a motor passing along the road caused him to leap high in the air. The sands of these dunes were steep, and his shoes got so full of sand that from time to time, in spite of the urgency of his errand, he was forced to pause in order to empty them out. He stumbled in rabbit holes, he caught his foot and once his trousers in strands of barbed wire, the remnant of coast defences in the Great War. He crashed among potsherds and abandoned kettles, but with a thoroughness that did equal credit to his wind and his Christian spirit, he searched a mile of perilous dunes from end to end, and peered into every important hollow. 2 hours later, jaded and torn, and streaming with perspiration, he came, in the vicinity of the clubhouse, to the end of his fruitless search. He staggered round the corner of it, and came in view of the 18th green. 2 figures were occupying it, and one of these was in the act of putting. He missed. Then he saw who the figures were. It was Captain Puffin, who had just missed his putt. It was Major Flint, who now expressed elated sympathy. "Bad luck, old boy," he said. "Well, a jolly good match, and we have it. Why, there's the Padre. Been for a walk? Join us in a round this afternoon, Padre. Blow your sermon." End of chapter 5. Recording by Kelsey Molyneux.
Part 1 of Miss Mapp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miss Mapp by E.F. Benson. Chapter 6, Part 1. The same delightful prospect at the end of the High Street, over the marsh, which had witnessed not so long ago the final encounter in the Wars of the Roses and the subsequent armistice, was, of course, found to be peculiarly attractive that morning to those who knew, and who did not, that the combatants had left by the 11:20 steam tram to fight among the sand dunes, and that the intrepid Padre had rushed after them in a taxi. The Padre's taxi had returned empty, and the driver seemed to know nothing whatever about anything, so the only thing for everybody to do was to put off lunch and wait for the arrival of the next tram, which occurred at 1:37. In consequence, all the doors in Tilling flew open like those of cuckoo clocks at 10 minutes before that hour, and this pleasant promenade was full of those who so keenly admired autumn tints. From here the progress of the tram across the plain was in full view. So, too, was the shed-like station across the river, which was the terminus of the line, and expectation, when the two-waggoned little tram approached the end of its journey, was so tense that it was almost disagreeable. A couple of hours had elapsed since, like the fishers who sailed away into the west, and were seen no more till the corpses lay out on the shining sand, the three had left for the sand dunes, and a couple of hours, so reasoned the cosmic conscience of Tilling, gave ample time for a duel to be fought, if the Padre was not in time to stop it, and for him to stop it if he was. No surgical assistance, as far as was known, had been summoned, but the reason for that might easily be that a surgeon's skill was no longer, alas! of any avail for one, if not both, of the combatants. But if such was the case, it was nice to hope that the Padre had been in time to supply spiritual aid to anyone whom first aid and probes were powerless to succour. The variety of denouements which the approaching tram, that had now cut off steam, was capable of providing was positively bewildering. They whirled through Miss Mapp's head like the autumn leaves which she admired so much, and she tried in vain to catch them all, and, when caught, take them off on her fingers. Each, moreover, furnished diverse and legitimate conclusion. For instance, taking the thumb, 1. If nobody of the slightest importance arrived by the tram, that might be because A. Nothing had happened, and they were all playing golf. B. The worst had happened, and, as the Padre had feared, the duellists had first shot him and then each other. C. The next worst had happened, and the Padre was arranging for the reverent removal of the corpse of 1. Major Benjy, or 2. Captain Puffin, or those of 3. both. Miss Mapp let go of her thumb and lightly touched her forefinger. The Padre might arrive alone. In that case anything or nothing might have happened to either or both of the others, and the various contingencies hanging on this arrival were so numerous that there was not time to sort them out. 3. The Padre might arrive with 2 limping figures whom he assisted. Here it must not be forgotten that Captain Puffin always limped, and the Major occasionally. Miss Mapp did not forget it. 4. The Padre might arrive with a stretcher. Query, whose? 5. The Padre might arrive with 2 stretchers. 6. 3 stretchers might arrive from the shining sands, at the town where the women were weeping and wringing their hands. In that case Miss Mapp saw herself busily employed in strengthening poor Evie, who was now running about like a mouse from group to group, picking up crumbs of cosmic consciousness. Miss Mapp had got as far as 6thly, though she was aware she had not exhausted the possibilities, when the tram stopped. She furtively took out from her pocket (she had focussed them before she had put them in) the opera glasses through which she had watched the station yard on a day which had been very much less exciting than this. After one glance she put them back again, feeling vexed and disappointed with herself, for the denouement which they had all so unerringly disclosed was one that had not entered her mind at all. In that moment she had seen that out of the tram there stepped 3 figures and no stretcher. One figure, it is true, limped, but in a manner so natural that she scorned to draw any deductions from that halting gait. They proceeded side by side across the bridge over the river towards the town. It is no use denying that the cosmic consciousness of the ladies of Tilling was aware of a disagreeable anticlimax to so many hopes and fears. It had of course hoped for the best, but it had not expected that the best would be quite as bad as this. The best, to put it frankly, would have been a bandaged arm, or something of that kind. There was still room for the more hardened optimist to hope that something of some sort had occurred, or that something of some sort had been averted, and that the whole affair was not, in the delicious new slang phrase of the Padres, which were spreading like wildfire through Tilling, a wash-out. Pistols might have been innocuously discharged for all that was known to the contrary. But it looked bad. Miss Mapp was the first to recover from the blow, and took Diva's podgy hand. "Diva, darling," she said, "I feel so deeply thankful. What a wonderful and beautiful end to all our anxiety." There was a subconscious regret with regard to the anxiety. The anxiety was, so to speak, a dear and beloved departed, and Diva did not feel so sure that the end was so beautiful and wonderful. Her grandfather, Miss Mapp had reason to know, had been a butcher, and probably some inherited indifference to slaughter lurked in her tainted blood. "There's the portmanteau still," she said hopefully. "Pistols in the portmanteau. Your idea, Elizabeth." "Yes, dear," said Elizabeth, "but thank God I must have been very wrong about the portmanteau. The outside porter told me that he brought it up from the station to Major Benjy's house half an hour ago. Fancy your not knowing that! I feel sure he is a truthful man, for he attends the Padre's confirmation class. If there had been pistols in it, Major Benjy and Captain Puffin would have gone away too. I am quite happy about that now. It went away and it has come back. That's all about the portmanteau." She paused a moment. "But what does it contain, then?" she said quickly, more as if she was thinking aloud than talking to Diva. "Why did Major Benjy pack it and send it to the station this morning? Where has it come back from? Why did it go there?" She felt that she was saying too much, and pressed her hand to her head. "Has all this happened this morning?" she said. "What a full morning, dear. Lovely autumn leaves. I shall go home and have my lunch and rest. Au reservoir, Diva." Miss Mapp's eternal reservoirs had begun to get on Diva's nerves, and as she lingered here a moment a great idea occurred to her, which temporarily banished the disappointment about the duellists. Elizabeth, as all the world knew, had accumulated a great reservoir of provisions in the false bookcase in her garden room, and Diva determined that, if she could think of a neat phrase, the very next time Elizabeth said au reservoir to her, she would work in an allusion to Elizabeth's own reservoir of corned beef, tongue, flour, bovril, dried apricots and condensed milk. She would have time to frame some stinging rejoinder which would escape her when next Elizabeth used that stale old phrase. It would have to be short, swift and spontaneous, and therefore required careful thought. It would be good to bring pop into it also. "Your reservoir in the garden room hasn't gone pop again, I hope, darling," was the first draft that occurred to her, but that was not sufficiently condensed. "Pop goes the reservoir," on the analogy of the weasel, was better. And better than either, was there not some sort of corn called pop-corn, which Americans ate? "Have you any pop-corn in your reservoir?" That would be a nasty one. But it all required thinking over, and the sight of the Padre and the duellist crossing the field below, as she lingered still on this escarpment of the hill, brought the duel back to her mind. It would have been considered inquisitive even at Tilling to put direct questions to the combatants, and still hoping for the best, ask them point-blank who won, or something of that sort. But until she arrived at some sort of information, the excruciating pangs of curiosity that must be endured could be likened only to some acute toothache of the mind, with no dentist to stop or remove the source of the trouble. Elizabeth had already succumbed to these pangs of surmise and excitement, and had frankly gone home to rest, and her absence, the fact that for the next hour or two she could not, except by some extraordinary feat on the telephone, get hold of anything which would throw light on the whole prodigious situation, inflamed Diva's brain to the highest pitch of inventiveness. She knew that she was Elizabeth's inferior in point of reconstructive imagination, and the present moment, while the other was recuperating her energies for fresh assaults on the unknown, was Diva's opportunity. The one person who might be presumed to know more than anybody else was the Padre, but while he was with the duellists it was impossible to ask him what had happened as to ask the duellist who had won. She must, while Miss Mapp rested, get hold of the Padre without the duellists. Even as Athena sprang full-grown and panoplied from the brain of Zeus, so from Diva's brain there sprang her plan complete. She even resisted the temptation to go on admiring autumn tints, in order to see how the interesting trio looked, when, as they must presently do, they passed close to where she stood, and hurried home, pausing only to purchase, pay for, and carry away with her from the provision shop a large and expensively dressed crab, a dainty of which the Padre was inordinately fond. Ruinous as this was, there was a note of triumph in her voice when, on arrival, she called loudly for Janet, and told her to lay another place on the luncheon-table. Then, putting a strong constraint on herself, she waited 3 minutes by her watch, in order to give the Padre time to get home, and then rang him up and reminded him that he had promised to lunch with her that day. It was no use asking him to lunch in such a way that he might refuse. She employed without remorse this pitiless force majeure. The engagement was short and brisk. He pleaded that not even now could he remember even having been asked, which was not surprising, and said that he and wee wifey had begun lunch. On which Diva unmasked her last gun, and told him that she had ordered a crab on purpose. That silenced further argument, and he said that he and wee wifey would be round in a jiffy, and rang off. She did not particularly want wee wifey, but there was enough crab. Diva felt that she had never laid out 4 shilling to better purpose, when a quarter of an hour later, the Padre gave her the full account of his fruitless search among the sand dunes, so deeply impressive was his sense of being buoyed up that some incredibly fatiguing and perilous excursion by some power outside himself. It never even occurred to her to think that it was an elaborate practical joke on the part of the power outside himself to spur him on to such immense exertions to no purpose at all. He had only got as far as this over his interrupted lunch with wee wifey, and though she too was in agonized suspense as to what happened next, she bore the repetition with great equanimity, only making small mouse-like noises of impatience which nobody heard. He was quite forgetting to speak either Scotch or Elizabethan English, so obvious was the absorption of his hearers, without these added aids to command attention. "And then I came round the corner of the club-house," he said, "and there were Captain Puffin and the Major finishing their match on the 18th hole." "Then there's been no duel at all," said Diva, scraping the shell of the crab. "I feel sure of it. There wouldn't have been time for a duel and a round of golf, in addition to the impossibility of playing golf immediately after a duel. No nerves could stand it. Besides, I asked one of the caddies. They had come straight from the tram to the club-house, and from the club-house to the first tee. They had not been alone for a moment." "Wash out," said Diva, wondering whether this had been worth 4 shillings, so tame was the conclusion. Mrs. Bartlett gave a little squeak which was her preliminary to speech. "But I do not see why there may not be a duel yet, Kenneth," she said, "because they did not fight this morning. Excellent crab, dear Diva, so good of you to ask us. There's no reason why there shouldn't be a duel this afternoon. Oh, dear me, and cold beef as well. I shall be quite stuffed. Depend upon it, a man doesn't take the trouble to write a challenge and all that, unless he means business." The Padre held up his hand. He felt that he was gradually growing to be the hero of the whole affair. He had certainly looked over the edge of numberless hollows in the sand dunes with vivid anticipations of having a bullet whiz by him on each separate occasion. It behoved him to take a sublime line. "My dear," he said, "the business is hardly a word to apply to murder. That within the last 24 hours there was the intention of fighting the duel, I don't deny. But something has decidedly happened which has averted that deplorable calamity. Peace and reconciliation is the result of it, and I have never seen 2 men so unaffectedly friendly." Diva got up and whirled around the table to get the port for the Padre, so pleased was she at a fresh idea coming to her, while still dear Elizabeth was resting. She attributed it to the crab. "We've all been on a false scent," she said. "Peace and reconciliation happened before they went out to the sand dunes at all. It happened at the station. They met at the station, you know. It is proved that Major Flint went there. Major wouldn't send Portmanteau off alone. And it's proved that Captain Puffin went there too, because the note which his housemaid found on the table before she saw the challenge from the Major, which was on the chimney-piece, said that he had been called away very suddenly. No, they both went to catch the early train in order to go away before they could be stopped, and kill each other. But why didn't they go? What happened? Don't suppose the outside porter showed them how wicked they were. confirmation class or no confirmation class. Stumps me. Almost wish Elizabeth was here. She's good at guessing." The Padre's eye brightened. Reaction after the perils of the morning, crab and port combined to make a man of him. "Eh, 'tis a bonny wee drappie of port whatever, Mistress Plaistow," he said, "and I dinna ken that you're far wrong in jalousing that Mistress Mapp might have a wee bitty word to say about it, again she had the mind." "She was wrong about the portmanteau," said Diva. "Confessed she was wrong." "Hoots! I'm not mindin' the bit portmanty," said the Padre. "What else does she know?" asked Diva feverishly. There was no doubt that the Padre had the fullest attention of the two ladies again, and there was no need to talk Scotch any more. "Begin at the beginning," he said. "What do we suppose was the cause of the quarrel?" "Anything," said Diva. "Golf, tiger skins, coal strike, summer time." He shook his head. "I grant you words may pass on such subjects," he said. "We feel keenly, I know, about summer time in Tilling, though we shall all be reconciled over the next Sunday, when real time, God's time as I am venturing to call it in my sermon, comes in again." Diva had to bite her tongue to prevent herself bolting off on this new scent. After all, she had invested in Crabbe to learn about duelling, not about summer time. "Well?" she said. "We may have had words on that subject," said the Padre, booming as if he was in the pulpit already, "but we should, I hope, none of us go so far as to catch the earliest train with pistols, in defence of our conviction about summer time. No, Mrs. Plaistow, if you are right, and there is something to be said for your view, in thinking that they both went to such lengths as to be in time for the early train, in order to fight a duel undisturbed, you must look for a more solid cause than that." Diva vainly racked her brains to think of anything more worthy of the highest pitches of emotion than this. If it had been she and Miss Mapp who had been embroiled, hoarding and dress would have occurred to her. But as it was, no one in his senses could dream that the Captain and the Major were sartorial rivals, unless they had quarrelled over the question as to which of them wore the snuffiest old clothes. "Give it up," she said. "What did they quarrel about?" "Passion," said the Padre, in those full, deep tones in which next Sunday he would allude to God's time. "I do not mean anger, but the flame that exalts men to heaven, or does exactly the opposite." "But whomever for?" asked Diva, quite thrown off her bearings. Such a thing had never occurred to her, for as far as she was aware, passion, except in the sense of temper, did not exist in Tilling. Tilling was far too respectable. The Padre considered this a moment. "I am betraying no confidence," he said, "because no one has confided in me. But there certainly is a lady in this town, I do not allude to Miss Irene, who has long enjoyed the Major's particular esteem. May not some deprecating remark—" Wee wifey gave a much louder squeal than usual. "He means poor Elizabeth," she said in a high, tremulous voice. "Fancy, Kenneth!" Diva, a few seconds before, had seen no reason why the Padre should drink the rest of her port, and was now in the act of drinking some of that unusual beverage herself. She tried to swallow it, but it was too late, and next moment all the openings in her face were fountains of that delicious wine. She choked and she gurgled, until the last drop had left her windpipe, under the persuasion of pattings on the back from the others, and then she gave herself up to loud, hoarse laughter, through which were shrilled the staccato squeaks of wee wifey. Nothing, even if you are being laughed at yourself, is so infectious as prolonged laughter, and the Padre felt himself forced to join it. When one of them got a little better, a relapse ensued by reason of infection from the others, and it was not till exhaustion set in, that this triple volcano became quiescent again. "Only fancy," said Evie faintly, "how did such an idea get into your head, Kenneth?" His voice shook as he answered. "Well, we were all a little worked up this morning," he said. "The idea—really, I don't know what we have all been laughing at—" "I do," said Diva. "Go on. About the idea." A feminine, a diabolical inspiration flared within wee wifey's mind. "Elizabeth suggested it herself," she squealed. Naturally, Miss Diva could not help remembering that she had found Miss Mapp and the Padre in earnest conversation together when she forced her way in that morning with the news that the duellists had left by the 11:20 tram. Nobody could be expected to have so short a memory as to have forgotten that. Just now she forgave Elizabeth for anything she had ever done. That might have to be reconsidered afterwards, but at present it was valid enough. "Did she suggest it?" she asked. The Padre behaved like a man and lied like Ananias. "Most emphatically she did not," he said. The disappointment would have been severe, had the two ladies believed this confident assertion, and Diva pictured a delightful interview with Elizabeth, in which she would suddenly tell her the wild surmise the Padre had made with regard to the cause of the duel, and see how she looked then. Just see how she looked then, that was all. Self-consciousness and guilt would let fly their colours. End of chapter 6, part 1.